I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Littman, and this is Battleground. Faz is still gone this week, spending time with his very cute new baby. Our guest this week on Battleground is Judd Legum, author of the popular information newsletter and founder of Think Progress.
Just opening up people's eyes to all the various ways that corporate interests that don't necessarily reflect the interests of regular people are shaping state politics, local politics, national politics.
Judd Legum, welcome to Battleground.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. You trained as a lawyer, you founded Think Progress, you worked for Hillary Clinton, you ran for office, you ran one of what is now, I believe, like the most popular progressive newsletters in the country. How did you get here?
Just a little bit at a time. I can't say that there was really a grand plan. I never really thought that I would be involved in producing media or writing. I've always been really interested in politics. I grew up watching C-SPAN and thinking about campaigns and what was going on and reading the newspaper and things like that. And went to law school. That's when I hooked up with John Podesta, Bill Clinton's last chief of staff. I was his research assistant. And then as I was graduating, he started Center for American Progress, which is a progressive think tank, and it was supposed to have a big communications element. So that's how I kind of got started on all of it. Started writing a newsletter then. That kind of developed into the blog Think Progress, because that was right around 2003 when the blogosphere, as they called it at the time, was sort of developing, and that's how I got into this kind of work where, research, writing, and trying to look at politics with a critical lens.
You are now editor-in-chief of Substack Popular Information, taken from a quote by James Madison, which says that a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. With that framing, can you talk a little bit about your newsletter? Why did you start it?
I tried to create both a economic model, but also a publishing cadence and a framework where I could really dive in and do like deep sort of accountability oriented work on different issues. Now, I can't say I knew exactly the kind of things that I would be focusing on as it's developed. It's been going about 3 years. I do a lot of corporate accountability work, looking at the FEC filings very closely, looking at state campaign finance filings, looking at SEC stuff, whatever I can, and just really digging in. I've done a lot on Facebook ads. I didn't have that all planned out, but I knew that I wanted to focus more on deeper dives into issues and hopefully try to find. I mean, the thing that's always the most exciting to me is just finding something new.
You mentioned this, like the thing that separates you from a New York Times is the follow-up, sort of paraphrase back, of it's not just making the promise, it's did they keep the promise? What incentivizes corporate media not to do that?
One, I think it can sometimes be very awkward for them to cover these corporate accountability stories. AT&T, which is one of the biggest political donors, and I feel like I read every time we're investigating something, I end up writing and focusing a lot on them. They own CNN. I think CNN does great work. I know a lot of the people who work there, they're good journalists, but it is awkward to cover them. I don't even necessarily think it might be like a conscious thing, but to just go at AT&T and really stick on it. It's like, you cover it once and that's probably enough. Maybe you figure you move on to something else. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is there's a lot of things that go on that people who are sort of part of the media political ecosystem, kind of the elite ecosystem, just recognize of like, oh, that's just the way things work. It's like, these large corporations, they give to Republicans and Democrats. That's just what happens. I think it can sometimes be easy for people who are in the know just to dismiss this as like not interesting. But if you dig in, I do think you can apply public pressure and public scrutiny to it.
Can you explain the way that corporate money ends up having an impact on a politician's voting behavior?
Yeah, I don't think it's, especially the money that comes through PACs, it's very small, especially for everyone involved, for the corporation, for the politician. it doesn't amount to much. But corporations have an extraordinary influence on politics through a whole variety of ways. I mean, one, let's take a company like AT&T. They're based in Texas. They have a huge number of employees who work in Texas. So just a huge number of voters and just the people who are driving the economy are connected to AT&T. They have 80 plus lobbyists in Texas. The other thing is companies both individually, going back to lobbying, both individually, but then through an entity like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has a huge amounts of money, huge amounts of lobbyists, huge amounts of connections. People are looking to them for guidance as to how do I support the business community. All of that adds up to a very significant influence on state and national politics. So it's this whole ecosystem, and really what the donation is almost kind of a signal of a much deeper relationship between a corporation and one or more, politicians.
So for a politician or a candidate to say, I'm not taking corporate PAC money is in a way, it's good virtue signaling, right. But it's not always like a meaningful financial hit.
No, it's not. It is becoming less and less meaningful, especially if you're a politician that, has a sort of modern fundraising apparatus. You can do well. I mean, that's why a lot of Democrats and a handful of Republicans don't take PAC money, because you can survive without it. But it's part of a much larger ecosystem that virtually everyone, is a part of.
There's the hard resources like money, and then there's the soft resources like relationships. You recently reported that 6 of Joe Manchin's former staffers are working as lobbyists for the fossil fuel and energy companies. And he's not the only legislator who has opened a revolving door between his office and these kinds of companies. Can you explain a little bit about how that works for people who may not be familiar and what it does to our politics?
Yeah, and I think it actually starts coming into play a lot earlier than it might seem at first blush. So what you have is, and I think of those 6, 3 of them were former Manchin chiefs of staff. So, really their highest person who, as a chief of staff, you're going to be talking to that person every single day. And then, you can make a lot more money, obviously, representing a trade association for oil company, for fossil fuel companies, or BP or whatever. So you've got a number of people coming from Joe Manchin's office who are now making a lot of money, and they're making a lot of money on the premise that they can have influence on Joe Manchin. What I think is underappreciated is the fact that if you are the chief of staff for Joe Manchin, or you're a top staffer, and you know that not now, but in 2 years and 3 years and 4 years, you might want to move over to X lobbying firm or X company or X trade association. There's a lot of ways that you can ingratiate yourself with that group even before that move is made. So just the whole culture that it creates. One thing we could do that might improve things somewhat is to pay congressional staffers a little more, because right now you have people who are on the Hill for a decade or longer, and they're still only making $60,000, $70,000 a year. It's not a horrible salary, but if you're living in DC and you have a family and things like that, eventually you want to make more. And right now, the lobbying firms are able to pay you a lot more.
We've talked about this in many different formats on this episode, from like a conversation about why consultants tend to run political campaigns is because it's in many ways because being a consultant is the most stable, lucrative way to stay in politics while also being an adult who has a family and a mortgage and all of that. Being a lobbyist is unfortunately seems like one of the most stable ways to stay in the political process while not having to work 80-hour weeks on Capitol Hill.
Yeah. And we've also created a system where so much of it can stay secret, even though it's impacting the public. So you do have to disclose if you are a lobbyist, if you register as a lobbyist. Of course, there's a lot of people who are effectively doing lobbying, but not technically, so they don't register. Probably the best paid people don't do that. But then once you do that, all the meetings, all the discussions, all the back and forth that goes on, that all stays secret. There's no disclosure. There's no way to get it through the Freedom of Information Act or anything else, because that's, Congress is exempted from that. So much of what's going on, there's just no visibility into. And I think that has a really corrosive impact on Congress, and I think it definitely contributes to why so few people have trust in Congress as a whole. Part of this is about holding corporations accountable for what they are doing in politics.
One of my favorite things that you have done at Popular Information is calling out corporations who publicly champion social justice efforts and then funnel money to legislators who act in direct opposition to that. Most recently, the Texas's anti-abortion bill. Name some of the worst offenders.
I mean, I think one that we mentioned before was AT&T. And it's not just that they're spending all of this money supporting, people with very extreme views that go well beyond just opposing abortion rights. I mean, we have a system in Texas now where they're putting, there's bounties on anyone who assists a woman in getting an abortion over 6 weeks, which I think, is just broadly people of all sorts of ideologies think that's over the line. I mean, I think it was like 80%. I saw a poll that opposed that. So it goes even beyond just the issue of abortion rights. But at the same time, a company like AT&T really invests like a ton of money in positioning themselves as champions of women, of gender equality, of women's rights. No one's forcing AT&T to spend lots of money on, promoted tweets about, female role models and how they're breaking barriers and how we need to support them. I mean, AT&T is talking about that. Their CEO is talking about how, gender equality is a core value. I think Coca-Cola is a good example because they're based in Atlanta. They've really latched on to the legacy of John Lewis, the connection of where they're situated with the civil rights movement. They have a lot of African-American employees at high levels. So it's a legitimate part of their corporate culture, but at the same time, they are, and as far as I know, continuing to support members of the Georgia legislature who have successfully rolled back time.
And I don't have an answer for this, but it's something I think about a lot in how to if the elected officials won't listen to me, the voter, will they listen to Apple? Will they listen to Coca-Cola? And that sucks to think that my voice matters less.
No, this is something I've thought about a lot too. Part of this is about holding corporations accountable for what they are doing in politics. So, for instance, after January 6th, a lot of companies decided that they would, pause or suspend their donations to the Republican objectors. Charles Schwab actually took a different approach, and they just shut down their PAC. That was their response. They just said, we're not going to have a PAC. And there's a lot of companies that don't have PAC. You don't need to have a PAC. And I actually think that's a fine reaction. I wasn't upset with that. I didn't consider that a cop-out. I considered that a pretty good response. Like, hey, maybe we just shouldn't be in the business of doing this. The problem is, the reality is, the impact of corporations right now is, we're so far away from that. I just think we kind of have to deal with the what the reality is. And if you look at, and I was thinking about this and just trying to get my head around it, but what the Chamber of Commerce, which is probably the most powerful lobbying organization in the country, represents nearly every major corporation with a couple of exceptions. What they're doing right now, opposing the reconciliation package, which means they're opposing paid leave. They were opposed to the For the People Act, opposing voting rights, all of the things they're doing, and the massive influence that has. Because the reason why we've had, the voting rights extended in the past, where it's not being now, is that it wasn't viewed at that time as a controversial issue. Walmart wrote George W. Bush in 2006 and said, we want you to support an extension of the Voting Rights Act. And it did happen. My only point being is I feel you, but it's just the reality is it's playing a huge role right now.
I'm not sure, and I'd be curious for your perspective here, if before 2016 corporations were seen as the arbiters of good and evil in the political process.
Most of this relates back to their employees and what people who are trying to attract very skilled employees are competing with each other. Apple is competing with Google, is competing with Facebook, is competing with AT&T, is competing with all these places. They want to work for some place that they feel good about. And so over the years, you've had corporations, whether it was, the bathroom bill in North Carolina, corporations played a huge role in that, decisive role. And you had corporations, their employees were expecting them to speak out. You saw a lot of corporations, when we had the murder of George Floyd, and, you saw all those black boxes with white text, with corporations saying that they were gonna, they were really committed to racial justice, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of that's driven by employees. But what's happened in response is that Republicans have attempted to impose costs on those. And some of it is public. For instance, after Delta came out against the Georgia bill. Now, this happened after it was signed into law, so it was pretty much pointless anyway. Cool. But eventually they realized that the backlash, I think within their own company and then also the public, was so strong, they put out a statement, saying that they opposed it. The Texas Senate passed legislation pulling back a very important tax credit on fuel for them. Now, it didn't pass the House, but I think that was like a shot across the bow. There were similar measures that were proposed, although not passed, in Texas, saying that, if you are a company that comes out in opposition to our voter suppression bill, they obviously didn't call it that in the bill, but, you're no longer going to be eligible for certain grants or tax credits and things like that. Not passed, but proposed. So that's why I think with this abortion bill, you really have corporations hanging back. And it's really been a more recent change. In 2019, Georgia passed a 6-week abortion ban. And you did have a lot of major companies, Warner Media, Disney, several others, a lot of the studios say we're not going to do business in Georgia if this bill goes into effect. Now, the courts knocked it down at that time. But you don't see, now there's less studio activity in Texas, from what I understand, but you're not really seeing the companies that are doing a lot of business in Texas speak out for the most part. I mean, I think most people would say corporations are powerful, but they're not necessarily in tune with the specific ways about, how they're impacting voting rights, how they're impacting taxes, all of this kind of stuff.
Is it inevitable that a conflict thousands of miles away, like the war in Afghanistan, won't get mainstream media coverage? And I guess a follow-up, how do you feel about the coverage of the withdrawal in the media?
Well, I thought there were a lot of problems with the coverage of the withdrawal. One of the things that I think was probably the defining moment for me and just my approach to all of this is watching coverage of the Iraq War. And just watching that and the coverage of that made me realize that you have to be skeptical of both the coverage and what you're being told. You can't just accept it, and there can be huge negative consequences for that. So I think that really colored a lot of my perceptions of what was going on in Afghanistan, because here we are 2 decades later, and finally we are getting out. And I think the major problem is that all the people that they were talking to were all the people who have been wrong about what's going on in Afghanistan for all of these years, both in an official capacity and an unofficial capacity as pundits. There were so few voices of people who have been critical of how long this war has gone on. So there was a real human cost to that, to the occupation and the continuation of the war, that I thought was missing. I thought that the coverage was abominable. I think that there's a lot of inherent support for war and military spending in the objective media that has no basis in any kind of objective measure.
You have really staked a claim as a progressive journalist. Like, there's no, you're not hiding the ball there on your political leanings. And I think, are there upsides and downsides to staking out that claim as opposed to being a, like, quote unquote objective journalist?
I think so. I think that in some cases there'll be people who are more hesitant to talk to you. Certainly, if you call up a Republican member of Congress and you say you're working for, the Wall Street Journal or CNBC, they're going to be more likely to talk to you than they are to me. But I don't think it's really a huge barrier. If you've got the goods, people will talk to you. I try to write stories that don't rely on other people's participation. I reach out to them because I want to be fair and give people a chance to tell me that I'm wrong. So I think it depends on, kind of what style you want. So if there's, if Joe Biden loses in 2024 and it's the Ron DeSantis administration and you want to read about like the inner workings of the Ron DeSantis White House,
keep it.
I'm not gonna be there's gonna be somebody who's gonna be able to do that well, and it's not gonna be me. To me, I feel like there's so much stuff that no one is. There's a lot of people going to be trying to crack that egg, but there's so much stuff that's just out there, and so many people that no one is talking to, and no one is calling, and so many documents that no one is looking at. I focus on that, and so in that case, I don't feel like it's a barrier, and I think being open about how I think and feel helps me build trust with the people who read me, because they know that I'm not like bullshitting them.
I once had a reporter explain to me that, at the end of the day, they have a boss. The boss expects content. The boss has a boss who also expects content. That boss has advertisers who need something to advertise against. So at the end, they are held accountable by that sort of chain of command and the economic structure of that media outlet that then means if you're not going to give them a quote for a story, they're going to have to find a story themselves. Who do you consider yourself accountable to?
I consider myself accountable to my readers. I think that not necessarily giving them something that they agree with, but giving them something that, makes them feel a little bit smarter or brings them some value. Otherwise, I'm relying on them to feel like it's worth enough to pay a little something for it. That's who I feel accountable for. And I think ultimately, that's all of media should be more accountable to the readers, which is why I'm much more into the subscription model than I am to the advertising model. If you write a newsletter for Politico and it's sponsored by Chevron, that doesn't necessarily mean you're taking marching orders from Chevron and everything in there is going to be approved by Chevron and is going to be something Chevron wants to read. But let's be honest. Chevron is only going to put their name and only going to pay money for a certain kind of newsletter that takes a certain approach. And it's not going to do that for other kinds of newsletters. It's reasonable to ask, why am I writing a newsletter that Chevron wants to be a part of? I'm not saying I necessarily know the answer to that exactly, but I do think to me it would be a red flag.
I want to close out by asking you for some advice. So correct me if wrong, but I think I would break down popular information sort of core beats or messages into there's too much money in politics. Politicians prioritize corporations over people. And the media, generally speaking, does a pretty bad job of covering all of that and then some. How do we fix this?
The first step is admitting you have a problem. So that's, I think, part of what I'm trying to accomplish with the newsletter is just opening up people's eyes to all the various ways that these interests, that corporate interests that don't necessarily reflect the interests of regular people, are shaping state politics, local politics, national politics. I mean, I think most people would say corporations are powerful, but they're not necessarily in tune with the specific ways about, how they're impacting voting rights, how they're impacting taxes, all of this kind of stuff. Once you do that, I think it can make it a more salient political issue. Ultimately, you are going to have people in power who are committed to being motivated by other things. And this isn't just an option that's available for Democrats, but if you had people who genuinely embrace that, then I think you could start to lessen the influence, and you would start getting policies that really were more focused on people.
I love that solution because it just means getting better people into the process, which is, my whole shtick. So thank you for taking the time to talk today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.